April 1945. A ruined German barracks stands in silence somewhere near Munich. The war is over, at least on paper, but the air still smells of smoke, diesel, and fear. Inside, under the cracked ceiling of a commandeered hall, a dozen German women stand in formation. Their uniforms, once pressed and proud, are torn, insignias ripped away. The black eagles and swastikas that once glittered on their collars now lie in a pile at their feet, stripped symbols of a broken empire. An American officer reads aloud, in slow, deliberate English, while an interpreter repeats every word in German. I renounce the National Socialist Party and its ideology. Some women whisper the words with trembling lips. Others stare into nothingness, refusing to speak. For them, this moment is more than defeat. It is erasure. The humiliation is quiet, methodical, complete. Cameras click in the corner, part of the U.S. Army's documentation effort. Outside, a cold rain begins to fall, washing the dust of war into the mud. For these women, once loyal servants of Hitler's Germany, this is not merely the end of a war. It is the beginning of judgment. Long before that final day in 1945, the idea of a woman standing in uniform under Hitler's banner was almost unthinkable. The Nazi state built its identity on hierarchy, and within that structure, women were defined by loyalty, purity, and service to the nation through motherhood, not military duty. Yet as Germany's ambitions expanded beyond control, the war demanded more than ideology could sustain. By 1941, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe began recruiting women in auxiliary roles: radio operators, clerks, nurses, and later, Flakhelferinnen, the female assistants who operated anti-aircraft defenses. At first, their uniforms lacked rank insignia, a symbolic reminder that they were helpers, not soldiers. But gradually, as the front lines devoured manpower, these women took on real authority, decoding transmissions, plotting bombing raids, managing logistics, and sometimes even directing anti-aircraft fire. To the Reich, they were propaganda gold. Posters showed them smiling beside aircraft guns or working with discipline in command centers. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda celebrated them as the backbone of the home front. Their faces appeared in newsreels representing loyalty and sacrifice. But behind that imagery lay indoctrination, training programs that taught not only technical skill, but unwavering faith in Führer and fatherland. At the Reich's elite schools, female officers were instructed in obedience and ideological purity. They swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler, their oaths echoing those of the male army corps. Many genuinely believed they were defending Germany's existence against foreign aggression. Others simply sought stability, a career or survival within a system that offered few alternatives. As the tides of war turned, their duties grew darker. In occupied territories, some served in administrative roles for the Gestapo or SS, managing paperwork tied to deportations and forced labor. Though not all were directly complicit in atrocities, they became part of a machine where neutrality was impossible. To serve the Reich was to enable its crimes, whether one believed or not. By late 1944, with the Eastern Front collapsing and Allied bombers reducing cities to rubble, these women were drawn closer to the battlefield. In makeshift command posts, under constant air raids, they worked through exhaustion and fear. Letters home spoke not of politics, but of cold, hunger, and death. The ideology that had once promised national renewal now demanded loyalty in ruin. When Hitler's empire finally fell, these female officers were among the first to face the consequences of that loyalty. To the advancing Allies, they were not civilians. They wore uniforms, carried ranks, and represented the apparatus of Nazism. Many were captured in uniform, confused and terrified, as American and British forces swept across Germany. Some surrendered voluntarily. Others were pulled from the ruins of communication centers and hospitals. In the eyes of their captors, they were not soldiers deserving of honors, nor innocent women of mercy. They were symbols, living remnants of a defeated ideology. In the days that followed Germany's surrender, Allied occupation forces began a systematic effort known as denazification. Every individual, from generals to teachers, was to be assessed, questioned, and judged for their role in supporting the Nazi regime. Forms were issued, interrogations conducted, and loyalty oaths demanded. The purpose was not revenge, it was purification, a psychological cleansing of a nation poisoned by dictatorship. But for the female officers, this process took on a different tone. They were not executed or imprisoned en masse like their male counterparts. Instead, they were humiliated publicly and symbolically, their uniforms confiscated, their insignias burned, their service records used as evidence of ideological guilt. In camps and temporary detention centers, they were ordered to recite oaths renouncing Hitler and the Nazi Party. To the Americans, these rituals were proof of moral re-education. To the women, they felt like staged confessions before a world that would never forgive. Some broke down in tears. Others stared silently, clinging to fragments of identity stripped away piece by piece. The once disciplined auxiliaries who had worked in radio rooms and command posts now stood before their former enemies, stripped of everything that had defined them. Their sense of purpose dissolved in the eyes of men who viewed them not as soldiers, but as symbols of a nation's collective sin. The war had taken their country. The surrender would now take their dignity. Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945 did not bring peace. It brought occupation. The country was divided into zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. In the American zone, order had to be rebuilt from the ashes of chaos. Cities lay flattened, millions were displaced, and an entire nation was now under investigation. The American military government quickly launched Operation Denazification, a sweeping policy designed to remove all traces of Hitler's ideology from public life. Every German citizen over the age of 18 was required to fill out a Fragebogen, a detailed questionnaire listing their political affiliations, wartime activities, and personal beliefs. But paperwork was only one part of this new system of justice. The Americans wanted to change minds. Across camps, schools, and local administrations, re-education programs were established. Newspapers were replaced with Allied-controlled publications. Radio broadcasts carried messages about democracy and human rights. In classrooms, children were taught about the crimes of the Nazi regime, often before their parents had even begun to accept them. Within this effort, a unique focus emerged: the women of the Reich. They had not fought with rifles, yet their uniforms bore the same insignia. They had served the system not as warriors, but as enablers: secretaries in SS offices, signal operators in Luftwaffe units, nurses at concentration camp hospitals. To American interrogators, this raised a moral question. How could ordinary women, so seemingly distant from the front lines, have played a role in sustaining tyranny? At first, the Americans viewed these women with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Interrogation reports from 1945-46 described them as obedient, indoctrinated, but often unaware of the full extent of the regime's crimes. Yet, in the eyes of U.S. authorities, ignorance was no defense. To rebuild Germany, every trace of loyalty to Nazism had to be erased, especially among those who had once worn its symbols with pride. Thus began a new phase of denazification, the oaths of renunciation. Female officers, particularly those captured from Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht communications units, were assembled in groups and made to publicly swear off allegiance to the Nazi Party and its ideology. The ritual was intended to be symbolic, almost theatrical. American officers read the statements aloud, often through interpreters, while the women were required to repeat them line by line. Cameras and reporters were sometimes present. These scenes were recorded not only as evidence of compliance, but as demonstrations to the world that Germany's submission was complete, even down to its women. The language of these oaths was deliberate. They began with a disavowal of Hitler and the Nazi Party, followed by an affirmation of freedom, justice, and humanity. The goal was psychological, to reverse years of indoctrination through public confession. But for many of the women, the ceremony felt hollow, humiliating, and foreign. Some complied reluctantly, others refused outright, choosing silence over betrayal of their past. A few were punished with isolation or delayed release from custody. In their testimonies years later, surviving female auxiliaries described those days as the longest humiliation of their lives, not because they still believed in Hitler, but because they were treated not as individuals, but as embodiments of a nation's shame. Their voices carried the weight of an entire ideology's collapse. Outside the camps, the atmosphere was no less tense. German civilians, hungry, displaced, and exhausted, watched as their former heroes were stripped of their rank and forced to repent. Some felt pity. Others believed it was justice. But for the women who had once stood at attention in crisp gray uniforms, the world had turned upside down overnight. The denazification tribunals that followed would eventually categorize millions of Germans into 5 groups: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. Most women were placed in the lower categories, considered followers who had acted under social pressure or ignorance. Yet the stigma never left them. Their service records marked them for life. Many were denied government jobs, social benefits, or even the right to teach. While the men of the Reich faced the gallows at Nuremberg, the women faced something quieter, but perhaps more enduring. They faced erasure. In the shattered streets of post-war Germany, they walked as ghosts of a vanished regime, neither heroes nor monsters, but remnants of a belief system that the world now demanded they forget. And yet, behind the silence, questions lingered. Did they ever truly believe? Or were they too victims, caught in a machinery that offered them no choice but obedience? The answer lay not in ideology, but in the fragile line between duty and guilt, a line the Americans would soon test through a series of moral confrontations that blurred justice with humiliation. When the war ended, the world looked at German men as aggressors and German women as enigmas, especially those who had worn the Reich's uniform. To the Allies, they were not innocent civilians, yet they were not combatants either. They existed in the gray zone between obedience and conviction, between duty and belief. This is where the human story of humiliation began. Many of these women had entered service as idealists. They were told they were helping defend their homeland, supporting soldiers, keeping communication lines alive. For some, it was patriotism. For others, simply a job. But when they stood before American officers in 1945, stripped of insignia, that pride turned to ashes. Eyewitness reports describe the scene. Rooms filled with women, once accustomed to authority, now forced to queue for questioning. Watched by guards younger than themselves. Their uniforms were confiscated, their photographs taken, their pasts dissected by foreign hands. Some pleaded that they had never harmed anyone, that they were only secretaries or operators. Others stood silent, as if words would only deepen the wound. It was not the loss of the war that crushed them. It was the loss of identity. The Reich had told them they were part of something greater, and now the same world demanded they declare it evil. The process did not just dismantle a political system, it dismantled a sense of purpose that had defined their lives. For women trained in discipline, This psychological unraveling was unbearable. A few fainted during interrogation. Others broke down during the reading of oaths. American psychologists noted these responses as shock withdrawal, a trauma response to ideological collapse. But to the women themselves, it felt like being stripped not of power, but of meaning. The question that haunted Allied interrogators was moral. What does guilt mean when one never pulled a trigger? Female officers of the Reich rarely fought on the battlefield. Yet their hands touched the paper trails of terror. Lists, messages, orders that sustained the machinery of war. Their guilt was administrative, invisible. To many of them, the connection between their desk and the front line seemed distant. But after 1945, that distance vanished. In the logic of denazification, every uniform symbolized complicity. Every armband, every oath, every signature on an official document carried moral weight. The Americans understood that a nation's evil did not survive merely through soldiers. It thrived through those who enabled it. And so, these women faced a moral reckoning without precedent. They were not on trial for war crimes. They were being judged for belief. To renounce Nazism was to admit guilt, not only for themselves, but for an entire generation. For many, it was a confession without crime. Interrogation transcripts reveal the psychological tension. Some women tried to rationalize their service. We believed we were protecting Germany. Others insisted we had no choice. But the Americans were not seeking explanations. They sought repentance. The purpose was to ensure that every remnant of Nazi conviction was crushed, even if that meant shaming those who had never killed. In that moment, humiliation became a tool of moral reconstruction. Publicly forcing officers to denounce Hitler was less about punishment and more about symbolism. The image of German women swearing allegiance to democracy was meant to represent a new Germany rising from the ruins, a Germany purified through shame. Nazism was not merely a political system. It was a faith. It promised destiny, unity, and strength. It gave its followers certainty in a world of chaos. Breaking that belief required more than military victory. It demanded spiritual conquest. The American occupation authorities knew this. Denazification was never just administrative. It was psychological warfare. Through education, censorship, and controlled ritual, they sought to rebuild German thought from the ground up. The ceremonies of renunciation were designed as public acts of unlearning. But belief does not die easily. Even after swearing the oaths, some of the women wrote privately in letters or diaries that they still could not fully reject the world they had known. One former Luftwaffe assistant recalled, "They told us to condemn him. I said the words, but my mouth felt foreign. It was as if I were erasing my own past." To the Americans, such resistance confirmed how deeply Nazism had taken root. They viewed these women as symbols of how ideology could infiltrate the most ordinary minds, a living warning of what happens when belief replaces conscience. Yet, to the women, the forced renunciations felt less like justice and more like humiliation. They were trapped between two systems, the one they had served and the one now judging them. Their internal conflict revealed something profound. That ideology, once internalized, cannot simply be switched off by decree. For many, the oath was an act of survival, not conviction. They said what they needed to say to go home. But inside, a quiet war continued, between memory and shame, between loyalty and truth. The Americans believed that through confession and humiliation, they could rewire a nation's conscience. But behind the ritual, behind the cameras and the paperwork, a deeper tragedy was unfolding, one that no document could record: the collapse of identity itself. And in that moral and psychological ruin, the next chapter of this story would unfold, where ideology met retribution and the humiliation of surrender became a new battlefield of the human mind. To understand the humiliation these women endured, one must understand how the human mind reacts when its belief system collapses. For years, Nazi propaganda had trained its subjects not only to obey, but to believe. Every film, every classroom, every oath reinforced the idea that loyalty was virtue, that to doubt was weakness. When the Americans made these women publicly renounce Nazism, they were not merely undoing allegiance, they were dismantling identity. Military psychologists from the U.S. Army's Information Control Division observed this process closely. They reported that the women showed signs of identity disintegration, the sudden loss of belonging that follows forced ideological reversal. Some reacted with anger, some with tears, others with complete emotional numbness. One American officer wrote in his diary, "They stood there, proud one moment, empty the next. They were not soldiers anymore, not even citizens. They were people without definitions." For the Americans, this reaction was expected, even desired. They believed that through humiliation and exposure to democratic ideals, a new Germany could be shaped. But the emotional toll on the individual was profound. Many women experienced deep shame that persisted long after the ceremonies. They returned to their destroyed towns unable to speak of their service. Some hid their pasts for decades, fearing discovery or scorn. The uniform they once wore with discipline became a secret. Their silence, in time, would become one of post-war Germany's most enduring taboos. In the chaos of Reconstruction, German society needed villains. The men who had led the Reich were gone, dead, imprisoned, or executed. But the machinery of the Nazi state had been vast, and its servants many. Female officers, visible and accessible, became easy targets for public blame. In newspapers across occupied Germany, American journalists described them as the obedient faces of evil. Their images, stripped of insignia, standing before Allied officers, were published as proof that Nazism's reach extended to every corner of society. Yet, paradoxically, these women were often powerless participants in that same system. For many Germans, seeing these women humiliated stirred conflicting emotions. Some viewed it as justice, the cleansing of a corrupted generation. Others saw it as cruelty, a punishment exceeding their guilt. In conservative towns, whispers spread that the Americans were breaking the women to humiliate the nation. In the years that followed, this perception hardened. Female auxiliaries and officers became invisible in public discourse. Post-war narratives glorified resistance fighters and condemned war criminals, but rarely spoke of the gray in-between, the millions who had neither fought nor resisted, yet had served. Their stories were buried under the rubble of Germany's recovery. When economic reconstruction began under the Marshall Plan, the focus shifted to rebuilding cities, not consciences. The humiliation of these women faded into silence, remembered only in private diaries, unpublished memoirs, or fragments in military archives. Yet, in those fragments, a quiet truth emerged, that war does not end when the guns fall silent. It continues in the hearts of those forced to live with its contradictions. To the Americans, these public renunciations were more than political statements. They were symbols of rebirth. The images of German women swearing off Nazism under Allied supervision were powerful propaganda tools, circulated both in Germany and abroad. They represented the triumph of democracy over tyranny and the moral cleansing of a nation. The ceremonies were often staged with precision. An American flag behind the interrogating officer, a translator by his side, the women lined up in their faded gray uniforms. Each oath was a performance, a ritual of transformation from citizen of the Reich to citizen of a new Germany. But beneath the surface, the symbolism cut both ways. For the Americans, it was redemption. For the women, it was exposure. Standing before the flag of the enemy, they were not simply renouncing a regime, they were confessing to the world that they had believed in a lie. This act carried a psychological weight that no punishment could match. It redefined what victory and defeat meant. In that moment, humiliation became an instrument of peace, a painful bridge between tyranny and democracy. The irony was cruel, yet profound. The very discipline that had made these women obedient under Hitler now forced them to obey the order to denounce him. Their loyalty, once praised, now demanded their repentance. And yet, through this ritual of humiliation, Germany began its slow, uneasy rebirth. The process would scar generations, but it would also anchor a lesson that the world would never forget. That ideology, when worshipped without conscience, always ends in shame. By the end of 1946, thousands of these oaths had been administered, recorded, and archived. But what remained unseen were the human remnants, the women who walked away from those halls, heads bowed, carrying the weight of both belief and betrayal. Their silence would echo across the next decade of German history, and it was in that silence, in the uneasy quiet of a conquered nation, that the story's turning point began to form. The moment when humiliation turned into confrontation, when the ritual of renunciation met resistance. It was mid-1945, a few months after Germany's formal surrender. In a former Luftwaffe barracks near Nuremberg, a group of female officers was assembled for what the Americans called a denazification ceremony. The room was cold, the concrete floor slick with rainwater tracked in from outside. The walls, once adorned with maps of conquests and strategic plans, were now bare, stripped of any trace of authority. The women stood in rows, their shoulders rigid despite the chill, eyes fixed on the American officers in front of them. These were women who had once supervised communications, coordinated air defenses, and maintained the bureaucratic backbone of a collapsing Reich. They had issued orders, trained younger auxiliaries, and represented discipline within the Nazi system. Today, they were stripped of rank, stripped of insignia, and forced into silence. An American officer, a major with years of occupation experience, began the ritual. His voice, steady and measured, read aloud the oath. "I renounce Adolf Hitler, the National Socialist Party, and all its teachings. I pledge loyalty to freedom, democracy, and the principles of humanity." An interpreter repeated the statement in German. One by one, the women were required to speak the words. Some whispered mechanically, lips barely moving. Others froze, shaking as the officer's gaze swept across the line. A few, heads high, refused to speak at all. Their silence became louder than any declaration, echoing through the hall and into the corridors of history. Cameras captured every angle. The Americans wanted a record not of coercion, but of submission. The footage was intended for both military archives and propaganda purposes. Proof that Nazism could be undone, even in its most loyal followers. The women understood this. They knew their humiliation was both public and permanent. Psychologically, the effect was immediate and brutal. Those who spoke felt their voices tremble against the weight of truth they were not ready to accept. Those who refused felt isolation, as if the world itself were judging them in real time. Officers reported that some women broke down entirely, sobbing quietly while others stiffened, staring straight ahead, as if steel alone could shield them from the moral collapse surrounding them. Among the most striking moments was that of a young communications officer, barely 23, who had coordinated anti-aircraft signals over Berlin during the final months of the war. She had issued orders that kept cities defended, and in her mind, she had served her country faithfully. But in the hall, faced with the command to repudiate everything she had been trained to uphold, she faltered. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. The major repeated the line patiently. Again, nothing. Finally, she shook her head, refusing to comply. Guards gently led her aside, and she was removed from the room under watchful eyes. Her defiance sparked tension among the others. Some whispered encouragement. Others glanced away, afraid to make a sound. The ceremony, intended to enforce unity in renunciation, instead revealed fractures between obedience and personal conviction, between public compliance and inner resistance. This was not merely a ritual. It was a battlefield of the mind. The Americans had designed it to extract confession. But in many cases, the women fought back with silence, with hesitation, with trembling resistance. Their former authority, stripped away, now collided with the imposition of a new moral order. The outcome was unpredictable. Some would speak the words under duress, others would refuse entirely, risking extended detention. The psychological calculus was complex. For some women, speaking meant freedom from custody. Refusal meant prolonged confinement and intensified scrutiny. For the Americans, however, the success of the ceremony was measured in compliance. Each repeated oath a small victory against the remnants of Nazi ideology. In this room, with rain pattering against broken windows and cameras capturing every movement, humiliation became a weapon. Not one of physical force, but of moral and ideological pressure. By demanding renunciation, the Americans converted the collapse of an empire into a personal confrontation for each officer present. As the last woman recited the oath, trembling but complete, the officer lowered his clipboard. The room fell into silence, thick with relief, shame, and unresolved tension. Yet for many, this was not closure. It was the beginning of reckoning, the moment when obedience under one ideology met coercion under another, and the human cost of belief became painfully visible. Outside, the rain washed over the shattered streets of Nuremberg, as if the city itself were mourning the collapse of a generation's ideals. Inside, the women left the hall quietly, carrying the invisible scars of a ritual meant to dismantle not just the symbols of Nazism, but the selfhood of those who had served it. The scene marked a turning point. For these officers, the war had ended, but their confrontation with authority, morality, and history had only begun. The next step would take them beyond the hall, into the long shadow of post-war Germany, a society grappling with guilt, memory, and the unspoken consequences of obedience. Not all ceremonies went smoothly. In one former SS administrative compound outside Munich, a group of female auxiliaries gathered under the strict supervision of American officers. These women had served in the Reich's bureaucratic machinery, processing orders, managing personnel files, and maintaining communication networks that facilitated both military operations and, indirectly, forced labor. The Americans had arranged the room with meticulous care. A U.S. flag hung at the front, an interpreter stood beside the officer, and cameras recorded every angle. The women, dressed in plain gray clothing, uniforms confiscated, stood in rows. Their eyes flickered between one another and the men in authority, searching for solidarity, reassurance, or a lifeline of defiance. The ritual began as always. "I renounce the National Socialist Party and its ideology," the officer intoned. The interpreter repeated the words. The women were required to recite them aloud. One by one, they complied. Their voices were hesitant, sometimes breaking mid-phrase. The act of saying the words was an internal surrender as much as a legal one. Yet some refused, standing rigid and silent. Guards moved quietly to separate them, offering no force, only the quiet weight of expectation. In one documented case, a group of 6 former Luftwaffe clerks refused to repeat the oath. They had been responsible for coordination at a key anti-aircraft command center. Their silence was deliberate, a statement that obedience to authority had not been entirely extinguished. The Americans, accustomed to compliance, noted the defiance as a moral residual of Nazi indoctrination. But it also revealed an unspoken truth. Ideology cannot be fully broken by ritual alone. As the ceremony progressed, emotions became almost unbearable. Some women wept silently, others stared blankly, eyes glazed, as if the act of renunciation had severed something fundamental. American observers noted the paradox. The very rituals designed to purify thought instead exposed the fragility of identity, the human cost of years spent in service to a totalitarian system. In one dramatic moment, a former communications officer collapsed during her oath, clutching the edge of the table for support. Medical personnel were called, but she refused assistance, insisting she could stand. Her collapse was less physical than symbolic, a manifestation of the psychological rupture occurring in real time. Fellow detainees looked on, unsure whether to intervene, to console, or to remain silent. The culmination of these ceremonies was not uniform. Some women completed the oaths, mechanically or with tears. Others left silently, escorted by guards. But each act, compliance or refusal, echoed far beyond the walls of the compound. These were public moments, recorded in photographs and reports, intended as lessons for both Germany and the world, that loyalty to Nazism could be renounced, even if grudgingly, that ideology could be confronted not with bullets, but with words and humiliation. The Americans believed these rituals were essential for rebuilding Germany. They were not trials, not criminal punishments, but instruments of psychological and moral reconstruction. Yet, in practice, the ceremonies created a second battlefield, one of conscience, shame, and survival. Every hesitant word, every defiant silence became evidence of the inner conflict these women faced. Historians have noted the significance of these moments. Unlike male officers, many of whom faced imprisonment or trial, these women were forced to confront their past in an almost theatrical manner. Their humiliation was carefully documented, and yet it carried a deeper weight. It marked the collision between personal survival and historical accountability. By the end of 1945, thousands of female officers across the American zone had undergone similar ceremonies. Some would integrate quietly into post-war society. Others would carry the psychological scars of humiliation for the rest of their lives. The rituals achieved a practical goal, outward renunciation, but they could not fully erase years of belief, indoctrination, and moral compromise. These events marked a historical turning point. The collapse of the Reich had been military, swift, and devastating. But the collapse of ideology, the forced confrontation with guilt and belief, was slower, more painful, and profoundly human. For these women, the war's true reckoning was not in the firing of guns, but in the enforced confession of a moral and ideological surrender that left lasting echoes in their lives. As the cameras stopped rolling and the officers dismissed the detainees, the women left the halls quietly, carrying the invisible weight of both obedience and shame. Outside, the streets of post-war Germany were littered with debris, mirroring the internal ruins they now bore. The humiliation was complete, but history demanded more than ritual. It demanded an aftermath, a reckoning with the consequences of service, ideology, and survival. The denazification ceremonies ended, but the story did not. The women returned to a world in which society, policy, and memory would continue to judge them. A world where obedience to authority was both condemned and misunderstood. Their lives would unfold in quiet struggle, bridging the gap between the fall of an empire and the slow rebuilding of a nation. And from that struggle, the aftermath of humiliation would emerge, a narrative of societal consequences, moral reckoning, and personal endurance that history would rarely record in full. The ceremonies ended, but the consequences lingered far beyond the halls of the camps. Female officers who had once carried the authority of the Reich now returned to a Germany fractured by war, occupation, and moral reckoning. For many, their names, records, and photographs remained in American archives, evidence of both service and submission. The first challenge was reintegration. Unlike men who faced tribunals or imprisonment for active combat, most women were categorized as followers in the denazification process. Their administrative or auxiliary roles were considered minor offenses, yet the stigma of service remained. Local communities, neighbors, and even families sometimes viewed them with suspicion. They were simultaneously victims of circumstance and symbols of a defeated ideology. Official U.S. Army reports from 1945 to 46 documented the experiences of these women. Interrogators noted recurring psychological patterns: shame, withdrawal, and anxiety. One report described a former Luftwaffe operator. She complied with the oath, but appeared emotionally paralyzed. She avoids speaking of her service and fears any public disclosure. These reactions were common. The humiliation of forced confession had lasting effects, affecting self-perception, confidence, and social integration. Employment posed another challenge. Many of these women had held positions of responsibility in communications, administration, or logistics. Post-war Germany, struggling with Reconstruction, often denied former Reich personnel opportunities, fearing ideological contamination. Some were barred from teaching or civil service. Others managed to find work in offices, factories, or medical facilities, but always under the shadow of their past. Their previous authority became irrelevant. Survival required adaptation and discretion. Society itself was conflicted. Some German civilians expressed sympathy for the women, seeing them as casualties of circumstance rather than willing collaborators. Others viewed them as guilty by association, complicit in a regime that had caused untold suffering. In rural towns, whispers circulated about the women of the Reich, a phrase carrying both contempt and curiosity. In urban centers, they were invisible, functional, quiet, and carefully unremarkable. The American perspective reinforced this duality. Military psychologists and occupation officers noted that the renunciation ceremonies had achieved their symbolic purpose. Women had publicly disavowed Nazism, but the process also revealed the limitations of ideological re-education. Compliance did not always equate to conviction. Many women recited oaths out of fear, obligation, or desire for release, while privately grappling with moral ambiguity. Historical records suggest that the psychological impact extended far beyond immediate humiliation. Letters, memoirs, and interviews decades later reveal lingering guilt and self-questioning. One former auxiliary wrote in 1950, "I said the words, but I cannot forget what I believed, what I obeyed, what I allowed myself to accept." Another reflected on the paradox. We were punished not for what we did, but for what we thought we had to do. This period also illuminated the complex interplay between gender and accountability. Male officers faced trials, executions, and long-term imprisonment. Women, by contrast, were subjected to public shame, restricted opportunity, and social scrutiny, forms of punishment that were subtle yet enduring. Their experiences highlight a post-war moral calculus in which authority, gender, and ideology intersected, leaving a legacy both personal and historical. By the end of 1946, thousands of female officers had returned to civilian life, yet the shadow of the ceremonies remained. Many avoided discussing their pasts entirely, fearing judgment, misunderstanding, or ostracization. In this silence, a historical invisibility took root. Whereas male war criminals became subjects of international law and media attention, female officers occupied a gray zone, neither fully culpable nor fully innocent. Their stories largely absent from textbooks and public memory. And yet, the impact of those ceremonies persisted, not only in the women themselves, but in the shaping of post-war Germany. The rituals of renunciation had imposed a moral framework on a society emerging from totalitarianism, creating expectations of accountability, obedience to democratic ideals, and public confession of past wrongs. The women's humiliation became part of the broader Reconstruction effort. a quiet lesson in the price of loyalty to a fallen regime. As the cameras rolled and the oaths were spoken, history was being written, not in newspapers or treaties alone, but in the faces of women carrying both the weight of belief and the burden of enforced repudiation. The next chapter would explore the longer-term consequences, how these individuals navigated a society that had survived yet remembered, and what this meant for Germany's collective memory. As 1946 turned into 1947, the consequences of the denazification ceremonies became more evident. Female officers, once visible symbols of Nazi organization, now lived in a paradoxical state. Their compliance had secured freedom, yet their past remained a social and moral burden. Even in families and communities that had once supported them, whispers lingered. Their previous roles in the Reich were never openly celebrated, yet they could never fully escape the shadow of suspicion. Many former auxiliaries and clerks attempted to reconstruct ordinary lives. They found work in offices, factories, or hospitals, often in positions far beneath the authority they had once held. Some married and relocated, seeking anonymity. Others returned to towns that still bore the scars of Allied bombing, where neighbors remembered uniforms, not names. These women carried with them the invisible weight of a past that could not be confessed without judgment. Official records show that American authorities continued to monitor their reintegration. Reports noted progress, but also persistent psychological strain, anxiety, shame, and the lingering memory of humiliation. Some women expressed resentment toward the ceremonies, recalling how the ritual forced them to publicly disavow beliefs ingrained over years. Others internalized the shame, never speaking of their service again, even to close family. Post-war German society mirrored these contradictions. Male war criminals faced tribunals, trials, and, in some cases, execution. Women, by contrast, faced informal but enduring consequences. Social ostracism curtailed careers and the moral scrutiny of their peers. Historians note that this gender disparity left female auxiliaries in a gray zone, legally forgiven but morally haunted. They were punished by shame rather than by law, their humiliation a tool for societal re-education. The broader societal effect was subtle but lasting. The ritualized renunciations became symbolic markers of accountability, demonstrating to German civilians that Nazism could not persist unchecked. They also reinforced the concept that obedience, even without direct violence, carried consequences. For many Germans, witnessing these ceremonies was a lesson in both morality and power. The defeated regime demanded no more loyalty, but society demanded acknowledgement of participation. Some former officers went on to document their experiences privately. Diaries, letters, and memoirs reveal nuanced perspectives. Pride in their technical skills, remorse for ideological complicity, and confusion about where personal responsibility began and ended. One survivor wrote in 1952, "We obeyed, but we were not evil. And yet, the world sees only the uniform." In time, historical research has brought these stories to light, highlighting the complex intersection of gender, ideology, and accountability. Scholars emphasize that the humiliation of female officers was not merely personal. It was emblematic of how a society confronts the remnants of a fallen ideology. By enforcing public renunciation, the Americans sought to prevent the resurgence of Nazism, but in doing so, they also created moral tension that persisted for decades. The long-term effects on post-war German memory are striking. While male perpetrators were publicly judged, women who had served in administrative and auxiliary roles largely vanished from historical narratives. Their stories were hidden in archives, private collections, and oral testimonies, often acknowledged only by historians decades later. The social silence around these women reflects both their marginalized culpability and the enduring discomfort with confronting complicity in wartime systems. Yet, despite the humiliation and marginalization, some women rebuilt their lives. They became office workers, teachers, or nurses. They married, raised families, and quietly integrated into a society that had survived, if not fully reconciled with, its past. Their compliance had been a survival mechanism. Their stories, once silenced, now serve as a testament to the human cost of ideological collapse. Ultimately, the aftermath of these renunciations demonstrates a harsh truth. The end of a regime does not erase the human and moral consequences of service within it. Female officers survived physically, but psychologically and socially, the ceremonies left indelible marks. Their humiliation, recorded in military archives and remembered privately, became part of Germany's broader post-war reckoning. A reminder that obedience, ideology, and personal morality are never easily disentangled. And from this aftermath emerges the final reflection, the philosophical closure on what these events reveal about humanity, ideology, and the burdens of obedience. The story of these women does not end with oaths, cameras, or post-war reintegration. It lingers in the quiet spaces between obedience and morality, between belief and survival. The humiliation they endured was not a spectacle of vengeance, but a mirror, reflecting the human cost of ideological servitude. History often measures war in battles, casualties, and treaties. But in this story, the battlefield is moral, psychological, and profoundly intimate. These women were never frontline combatants, yet they carried the weight of an ideology that demanded absolute loyalty. Their punishment was subtle, yet enduring. The stripping of rank, the enforced renunciation, the social suspicion that followed them for decades. It was a war fought not with weapons, but with conscience. The renunciations, however, also carried meaning beyond personal suffering. They symbolized a society attempting to reckon with collective guilt, to rebuild on the foundations of accountability and moral clarity. By forcing these women to confront their complicity, even in small administrative acts, the Allies illustrated the principle that ideology, when embraced unquestioningly, leaves indelible marks on both the individual and the nation. Yet the story is not one of simple judgment. It is a story of ambiguity, of human complexity. These women were neither monsters nor saints. They were products of a system that demanded obedience, and their choices were constrained by circumstance, fear, and indoctrination. The humiliation they suffered reminds us that survival in a morally compromised world often comes at the cost of dignity, and that history is rarely neat in its delineations of right and wrong. In reflecting on their experiences, one sees the enduring lessons of 1945, that ideology can shape identity more deeply than we realize, that accountability extends beyond the battlefield, and that the consequences of belief, even when passive or administrative, ripple through generations. The images of these women, once proud and now humiliated, endure not as symbols of shame alone, but as cautionary testimony to the fragility of conscience under authority. In the quiet aftermath of war, when the guns have silenced and cities lie in rubble, history is not only written in treaties or tombstones. It is written in the faces of those who survived, in the eyes of women who once served, who once obeyed, and who once stood, uniforms intact, only to leave them behind and confront the weight of a fallen ideology. Their story is a meditation on obedience, belief, and the human cost of war, a reminder that the consequences of our choices, however constrained, echo far beyond the moment, shaping both individual lives and the moral fabric of history itself.